Well, thank you for coming, and it's a super audience. And I think Daniel's book deserves it, actually. I think of all the books I've read in recent years, it's absolutely great. We're going to have a sort of structured conversation to try and bring out what this book's about, and then we'll open it up to you all. I think there were several things that drew me to this and to Daniel's work. He's a philosopher, big ideas, but also an economist. It's an unusual combination. I mean, we do have, Adam Smith, John Hume, who were in that style, but it's certainly in recent times, it's an unusual combination. I'm sort of attracted to the way he's, very boldly dealt with, the really big ideas, freedom, equality, fairness, what do these things mean? And this is where we get into John Rawls, and it's dealing with big ideas in a sort of normative way. In other words, it's not just dealing with ideas for the sake of it, but what you do about it. How do you translate these big ideas into action? And I think Daniel goes beyond that. I mean, we don't just talk about action in a broad sense, but into the nitty-gritty of policy. And there's somebody like myself who's been in the rather grubby world of policy making in the political life for 20 years. I'm attracted to that. And then the final reason I'm drawn to this is that, what came out of our conversations earlier, and the London School of Economics, and is apparent in the book, is that he sort of identifies himself with what we call the liberal tradition, which is essentially where I am. And I thought maybe we'd start our conversation there because, liberalism, liberal democracy, these are, easily used, cheaply used words. You've got liberal Democrats in Russia who are essentially fascists and denounce Putin as an appeaser and a weakling and too tolerant of civil liberties. And you've got liberal Democrats ruling Japan, and would be called, I think, conservative in any other country but Japan. And you've got liberals, a key part of German government, and they're kind of free market ordo-liberals. And you've got conservatives here who call themselves social liberals because they're very tolerant, or would say they are, about race and sex and gender and so on. And you've got people in the middle of British politics who call themselves social liberals in the tradition of early 20th century reform. And then you've got American liberals in the Roosevelt, LBJ, Biden tradition, believers in positive use of the state. And then you've got sort of ultra-liberals who feel so strongly about liberalism and they want to stop people being illiberal. So there's a whole jumble of ideas and strands and parties. I mean, how do you make sense of all this? And where do you come out where you do?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that lovely introduction and description of just how complicated an idea, slippery a term liberalism is. And the book is a defense of liberalism, but not just a defense of liberalism, it's also an attempt to sort of rehabilitate liberalism, particularly as a progressive public philosophy. And as you mentioned, John Rawls, the philosopher, is my inspiration, and I'll maybe come back to him in a minute. But I think what I wanted to, what the book doesn't do, it's not a history of liberalism or a mapping of all the many varieties of liberalism, some of which Vince just described. It's an attempt to make the case for what I see as the best version of liberalism, and to show that liberal philosophy can be useful here and now in answering the really difficult questions that are at the heart of so much of our political debate, whether that's questions about free speech and abortion rights, or how we structure the political system, what we should do about capitalism, and how we should protect the environment. So what I wanted to do was to show that liberalism could be helpful and useful now, not just as an intellectual exercise, but really as a political one, to show that these are ideas that could be the basis for the kind of big picture progressive political vision that I think we have been missing for a long time, and the absence of which I think is a real obstacle to the success of progressive political parties in the UK and elsewhere. And coming to Rawls, Rawls is very much, really the preeminent philosopher of the 20th century. He's very much identified with the liberal tradition too. And I think what's exciting about Rawls to me is that his ideas are not just philosophically interesting, they are useful, they're hopeful and constructive. So Rawls described his project as trying to articulate a realistic utopia, so a picture of the best that a democratic society could be, given what we know about what humans are really like, about human nature and the way that institutions actually work in practice. And it's that sort of what I've tried to do in the book is really pick up where Rawls left off. So Rawls provides us with a set of principles for thinking about justice, and what I've tried to do as both economist and philosopher is to really think through how it is that we would put his principles into practice. In terms of where Rawls sits within the sort of wider liberal tradition, I guess there's really two broad, amongst the many varieties that you described, there's two kind of overarching schools of thought within liberalism. There's a classical liberal tradition that has typically really prioritized freedom, and particularly economic freedoms, and had a very strong attachment to a kind of laissez-faire model of capitalism. And then there's a social liberal tradition, and that's where I think Rawls sits, and that's the tradition that's really tried to combine a commitment to freedom and equality at the deepest level. And I think that's sort of Rawls's great philosophical contribution, was to articulate a version of liberalism that really succeeded in showing how it is that freedom and equality would fit together.
Yes, well, let me just take that as a jumping off point. As you say, one of the key points about Rawls was that he didn't regard freedom and equality as things which you have to choose between. There's no trade-off between the two. They're entirely compatible, and you can have freedom and you can have equality. And that's not the way we normally polarize debates here. Freedom is seen as some extent at the expense of equality. So I just wondered if you can talk us through how we do reconcile the two, and probably a good way of doing it is just to take one or two concrete examples. One of the changes that we are promised after the next election in the UK is a clamping down on independent schools, not in prohibition, but through taxation. And the classical liberal who values freedom will say, well, why on earth shouldn't I send my child to an independent school? Why on earth are you trying to discourage us exercising our freedom? And we pay our taxes, and why shouldn't we do it? And then on the other hand, you've got people who say, well, this is just perpetuating inequality, and we've got to discourage it as far as possible. So how do you, in your world, how would you deal with that practical issue? And more generally, how would you help us to reconcile these two things that are often seen as opposites?
Yeah. So maybe I'll take the general question first, and I think the best way to explain it is to take a little diversion into what Rawls's philosophy actually is about. So, and for Rawls, reconciling, this tension between freedom and equality is the classic tension within democratic thinking that goes back, over hundreds of years. And I think before Rawls, both philosophy and politics was, and I think even maybe the same is true today, typically divided between a school of thought, kind of classical liberalism that prizes freedom, often at the expense of equality, and then a socialist tradition that's seen to prioritize equality, sometimes at the expense of freedom. And Rawls's project was to try to show how these two values fit together, and I think that's part of what's exciting to me about his philosophy, is that he really succeeds, I think, in bringing together the best of the liberal and the socialist tradition, and showing how those two traditions can really complement one another. And I think to sort of understand how he does that, I should just explain a bit about his philosophy. So that the core idea of his philosophy is that society should be fair, which may sound sort of blindingly obvious and also doesn't really take you very far, because obviously lots of people, everyone disagrees, or maybe not everyone, but there's lots of disagreement about what exactly fairness means. And his sort of key philosophical idea, which you had a sort of introduction to with the icebreaker question, is that if we want to know what a fair society would look like, we should imagine how we would choose to organize it if we didn't know what our position in that society would be. So whether we would be rich or poor, black or white, gay or straight. And that thought experiment is, I mean, I think it's very intuitive. I think it's pretty much immediately obvious that we wouldn't choose to organize society as we do today, where people's opportunities continue to depend so much on class, race, and gender, on circumstances that are beyond their control, and where economic resources are so concentrated at the very top. But Rawls is not just interested in critiquing society. He wants to put forward a positive vision of what a genuinely fair or just society would look like. And so what he does is use this thought experiment to articulate two basic principles, one to do with freedom and one to do with equality. And the thought experiment is really his mechanism for trying to work out how these two values fit together. So what he argues is that if we didn't know what our position in society would be, the first thing we would want to do is to make sure there was a guarantee that our most fundamental freedoms would be protected. And for Rawls, those freedoms are both personal freedoms, so freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of sexuality, but also political freedoms, the freedom to participate in democratic politics as a genuine equal. So not just the formal equality of having the right to vote, but having genuinely equal opportunities to take part in and shape political decision-making. So the first thing I think that Rawls does in trying to reconcile freedom and equality is to move beyond just the abstract notion of freedom towards a list of the freedoms that are really fundamental. And for him, it's those personal and political freedoms. Then he has a second principle that's to do with equality. And again, the point of that principle is to move us beyond just the idea that equality is something that's good towards a particular interpretation of how much equality it is that we should be aiming for in society. So what he argues is that his conception of equality has really got two parts. First is what he calls fair equality of opportunity. That's not just the absence of discrimination, but making sure that everyone has a genuinely equal chance to develop their talents and capabilities in life. And then alongside equality of opportunity, he also argues that we need not equal outcomes, but fair outcomes. And specifically, he argues that we should organize our economic system so that the least well-off are as well-off as they can be. And he calls that the difference principle. And the basic idea is that a degree of inequality can be justified in society because it can provide incentives so that people work hard and innovate, and that's very important for the functioning of a market economy. But those inequalities are only justified if they actually benefit everyone, and particularly that they should benefit the least well-off as much as possible. So that principle is really a way of trying to reconcile the importance of economic efficiency and the value of markets with a commitment to equality. So I think that's the sort of shortish summary of Rawls's philosophy and the way in which he tries to reconcile those principles. And then, I'm conscious I've given quite a long answer, but those principles are basically they are then the basis for answering a whole, huge range of specific practical policy questions, like the question of the role of independent or private schools in society. And really the point of my book is sort of split into two parts. So the first part is essentially a summary of Rawls's ideas aimed at people who are more, who are interested in politics and not just philosophy. But the second part, which is really the bulk of the book, is taking up those ideas and thinking through them sort of step by step and trying to address all of the different policy questions that come up. So maybe if I just take the example of independent schools. So, the guiding principle, I think, for designing an education system is equality of opportunity. That's a principle that's shared across political parties. And a core part of equality of opportunity is the idea that access to education should not depend on the random circumstances of birth, including parental resources or race or gender or anything else like that. And I think it's pretty obvious that the existence of private schools creates a real problem for equality of opportunity. I think that's true in theory, it's obvious, but in practice we see what that looks like in the UK. So about 7% of children go to private schools at the moment. They benefit from about 3 times the total amount of educational resources at those schools compared to the typical state school student. And then that group go on to have significantly higher earnings. I think it's about 40% higher by the time people are in their early 30s, and to dominate most elite professions. So former private school students account for about 2/3 of judges, about half of MPs and newspaper columnists with all the massive political and cultural influence that they have, and about 1/3 of business leaders. So I think it's clear that private schools are a problem for equality of opportunity, and in the book I argued that definitely we should be levying VAT on private schools. It makes no sense to have to be subsidizing a system that undermines one of the principles that's right at the heart of the purpose of our education system. I actually argue that we should go further, that it would be better to phase out private schools entirely, which is something that Finland did in the early 1970s. Finland it wasn't the slippery slope on the way towards some kind of socialist authoritarian nightmare. It didn't do any harm to Finland's school system. Finland's school system is one of the best ranked school systems, both for overall quality and the equality of outcomes for children from different backgrounds. And as Vince mentioned, obviously the classic liberal response to that, or some liberals I think recoil at the idea of banning private schools outright. And part of the aim of my book, at least in that discussion, is to show that there are really impeccably liberal arguments for doing that. And sorry, I won't give such long answers after this one, but the way that I think about it is, what's brilliant about Rawls's theory is that he tries to distinguish between the freedoms that really matter and those that are not so fundamental. So for Rawls, there are some parental freedoms that are so fundamental that we shouldn't violate them, even if that means equality of opportunity will be difficult to achieve. So we can't prevent parents from reading to their children or introducing them to their friends, even though we know that the fact that some parents will do that and others won't will give some children opportunities that others won't have. Similarly, we obviously can't take children away from their parents and put them in a kind of institutional setting, even though that would be brilliant for equality of opportunity, because that would violate the fundamental freedom that we have to a private family life. But the freedom to spend unlimited sums of money on your children's education just doesn't have the same importance. It's not an essential freedom in order for parents and children to have the kinds of loving, nurturing relationships that are what we should really be, that are the thing that those fundamental freedoms are there to protect. And I think philosophically, that's how Rawls then opens up the possibility for making a liberal argument for abolishing private schools.
Yes, in your answer, I sensed that you were exposing a little bit one of the big sort of contradictions in what Rawls is about, because as you say, he acknowledges that in a liberal but effective economy, you've got to have markets, you've got to have entrepreneurs, what we call capitalism, right? But you're also saying to your entrepreneurs that, well, you're free to make money, but we don't want you passing it on to the next generation or privilege. And I just wonder if in part of that contradiction, there is the issue of property rights, because for many people who would call themselves classical liberals, property rights are absolutely fundamental to a free society, whether it's physical property or intellectual property. So how does Rawls and you see property rights, and how fundamental is it to the workings of capitalism?
So I think first, I wouldn't see it necessarily as a contradiction within Rawls's theory. I think what's great about Rawls's theory is that he's recognizing that this tension does exist between the benefits that come from a free and dynamic market economy, and the importance of making sure that those benefits are widely shared. So I think rather than being a contradiction, he's trying to provide us with a coherent framework for resolving a tension that I think most of us recognize is a real one. In terms of the question of property rights, I guess I think of, that property rights are the rules about how property of all sorts is controlled and distributed, and having clear and transparent property rights, that's clearly fundamentally important. Without that, people can't plan their lives and sort of, that's a sort of essential component of the rule of law, in a sense, is to have at least clear and transparent property rights. But for Rawls, and I think for me, the question is what should which property rights should we have? How much power, for example, should the owners of companies have over the way that companies are organized? Or to what degree should people be free from taxation or from regulation of the state? No one, only the most extreme libertarians think that property rights of those sorts are absolute. There's always a question about exactly what the nature and shape of those property rights should be. And in a sense, Rawls' his second equality principle is meant to be a framework for working out what the ideal system of property rights would be. And that, for Rawls, I think there's sort of two parts to it. First, there are some property, or I think I would call them more economic freedoms rather than property rights. There are some economic freedoms that are so important that we should think of them as part of that set of really fundamental basic liberties. So the freedom to own personal property, that's one of them. Freedom to have, to own your own house and to own your own clothes, that's really fundamental because it's essential for living a free and independent life. Similarly, freedom of occupational choice, that's another truly fundamental freedom because of the importance that work has in giving shape and meaning to each of our lives and just the amount of time that it takes up. But beyond that, what property rights should look like, what the level of taxation should be, how much control owners should have over companies, those questions all depend on basically which system of property rights we think would best promote the interests of the least well-off in society. That's Rawls's ultimate benchmark, I guess, for thinking about what those property rights should look like. And I think that's the basis for developing a very interesting model of what capitalism could look like. So I think for Rawls, that the concentration of ownership that exists in capitalism as we know it is fundamentally unjust. Getting rid of that doesn't mean abandoning markets or neglecting the value of a dynamic market economy. It means trying to restructure markets in a way that means that they genuinely work for everyone, which would include making ownership much more widely shared, giving workers and owners a much more equal say over how companies are run, and all sorts of other practical suggestions that maybe we can come back to later.
But I think your critics and Rawls' critics on the right, if I might put it that way, would say, well, this is all a bit fuzzy and not very satisfactory, because we know in practice that the only capitalist systems that work are either the ones that are rooted in very firmly in shareholding and asset ownership, property, or those that are state capitalists of the kind that you get in China, and also works. But the idea of having, distributed property ownership is just pie in the sky. I mean, I'm being a devil's advocate, but this is the argument that would be made. And you have quite a long section on the book on worker cooperatives and shareholding. And I think, people in my tradition will say, well, these are wonderful ideas and people have written extensively about them, but there's no way they've ever worked except on a microscopic scale. And all the decent companies we had, the Rowntrees and Cadburys and Clarks and so on, who tried to make these things work, it never did. And ultimately, you have to make choice. I mean, if you want a capitalist market economy, it's got to be rooted on some very strict limiting principles, And you can't diffuse ownership in the way that you've described. You know, workers' co-ops are a lovely utopian idea, but they don't work. I mean, I'm quote. What's your rebuttal of that?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think rebutting those ideas is a really important part of the book, and that's where my kind of me with my economist hat comes in, because I think those criticisms are just not grounded in the latest economic evidence. So if we maybe split the question into the two parts, one, I guess there's a question about the overall level of taxation, how much, you know, to what extent can you tax the rich without undermining the dynamism of a market economy? And I think our public debate is still dominated by ideas from the 1970s that underpinned trickle-down economics and Thatcher and Reagan's economic programs, the idea that cutting taxes for the rich or having a lower overall level of taxation was the key to economic dynamism and prosperity. And I think to some extent those ideas were reasonable ideas to hold in the 1970s, that some economic theory supported them and there really wasn't that much evidence, and to be honest, economics in the 1970s was a highly theoretical discipline anyway. And since the 1970s, we've had 40 years of experience with what happens when you cut taxes for the rich. And we now know that it's had essentially no benefits in terms of the overall rate of economic growth. And if anything, I think the evidence suggests that countries that have become more unequal are less dynamic and less prosperous. And even institutions like, you know, the IMF and the OECD, not exactly kind of hotbeds of economic radicalism, you know, they also hold the view that from where, at least from where we are now, higher taxation and more equality would be good for economic growth rather than bad for it. And we just, you know, we know that from all sorts of studies, but you know, you really can just look at the fact that there are countries that have an overall level of taxation in excess of 45% of GDP, like France and Denmark and a handful of others that have taxes over the 40% threshold. And there's no relationship between having higher taxes and having either a smaller economy overall or a slower rate of growth. So I think that trying to update our understanding of how market economies work and the possibilities for combining higher taxation with economic prosperity, that's a very important challenge for progressives, and I think there's a lot of really good evidence to build on. In terms of the distribution of ownership, the possibilities for cooperatives and different forms of workplace democracy, you know, I think the cooperatives are a slightly more difficult case. The main argument I make in the book is for a German-style system of co-management where workers have significant representation on company boards, and there are also works councils which are elected by workers, and they also have a say over how companies are run on a more day-to-day level. And that is a system that operates at scale in Germany and in quite a lot of other European countries. And again, all of the latest economic evidence suggests that those economies work very well. There's no evidence of negative effects of even quite radical forms of co-management, such as what we see in Germany on overall levels of investment, on the longevity of companies, and all the sorts of metrics, I suppose, that economists look for measuring economic performance. And we now have a better understanding of why that's the case. It's because it encourages workers, essentially encourages a more cooperative relationship between workers and owners, and it encourages employees to invest in skills in their company because they think they might share in the benefits. And anyway, I suppose there's lots of other ideas. So I think my response, ideally in a pithier way than I've just done, would be to rebut those arguments with the latest economic evidence. I don't think you just have to appeal to the idea that these are desirable things. I think we now know that they can work and that they can work at scale.
Yes, I mean, your critics on the right would say that the Wirtschaftswunder died a long time ago, and there isn't very much dynamism left in an economy based on those principles, as opposed to the United States. But I think we're getting down into the weeds.
Yeah, but I think what's attractive about Rawls's framework is that it allows for these kinds of empirical arguments. It's not a dogmatic framework that says we should have, all firms should be cooperatives no matter what the consequences for economic growth. I think it gives you this framework for balancing the sort of the variety of considerations that are relevant here, for taking a more pragmatic perspective. So I think of that as I think that's a strength of this approach rather than a weakness. Particularly, it's a strength of this approach over some more dogmatic socialist approaches to economic organization.
Well, what you call dogmatic socialists, I'll be one for a few minutes, would say this is all a bit, wishy-washy. There is a couple of books out at the moment that are advancing the cause of limitationism, I think it's called.
Limitarianism.
Sorry, I haven't got the word right. But basically saying, can't we just limit people's individual income and wealth? It's not a question of just stopping trickle down. Why don't we just put a limit on it? And, the happy days after the Second World War, people were taxed 95% on their unearned income. And, people didn't think that was unreasonable. They got on with life. So why don't we impose a fixed limit, or virtually a fixed limit through taxation or controls on how much people can earn, whether it's executive salaries or everybody's salaries, or why don't we put a limit on the amount of savings, asset pots that people can have before they're taxed penally? I mean, so socialists will say, well, why on earth don't you just get on with it if you believe in fairness?
Yeah. Well, I actually think that the arguments for having a limit on wealth are quite strong. So I'm not necessarily against it, and I don't think it's fundamentally contradicts anything that's in Rawls's philosophy. And I think the proposals that are out there at the moment for limiting wealth. So Ingrid Robbins has a book out called Limitarianism, where she argues that she proposes that there should be a maximum amount of wealth that anyone is allowed to hold, and she puts the exact threshold, I think, is up for debate, but she suggests something in the region of 10 million pounds or dollars. And I'm not sure exactly where I would draw the line, but I think there are quite strong arguments from within Rawls's philosophy for doing something like that. The first is that doing so is important for protecting the fundamental principle of political equality. So for Rawls, that, as I said at the beginning, that's part of his first principle of justice, this basic liberties principle. There's the personal freedoms and then political freedoms. And the idea is that those freedoms are so important that we need to organize our society and an economy in a way that achieves those freedoms before we start to think about economic growth and how equal our economy should be. And I think there probably is an amount of wealth that's just incompatible with a healthy democratic society. I think there's some debate. It sort of depends, I guess, on the extent to which you think you can insulate the political process from concentrations of wealth. I think there's much more that we could do to limit private donations to political parties, to put in place a completely different system of public funding for political parties. But if it's not possible to insulate politics from inequality, then I think it would be reasonable to have a hard limit on wealth. So that's the sort of the argument from democracy for why that's something we should consider. And I also think there are economic arguments for it. I'm not sure that the opportunity to accumulate vast amounts of wealth is not that's not what drives most entrepreneurs. First of all, when people start off running a new company, it's an extremely risky venture. There are very few people who think that it's likely that they're going to end up with billions. People will be, the most entrepreneurs, I think, would be satisfied with a lot less than that. And in any case, starting a new company is often about much more than earning money for a lot of people. So I don't know. I think I'm skeptical that the economic arguments are overwhelming against some kind of limit on wealth. But
I think we're in danger of agreeing with each other.
Sorry, I was meant to be disagreeing with that, but I think I think it's compatible with this way of
But
thinking.
there is a problem, isn't there, with us sitting up here pontificating about the world, or, and our moral philosophy, and whether it's Rawls or someone else, and actually translating this into political reality. And the whole Rawls philosophy, I mean, it's peppered with the word reasonable people's judgment. But what if we live in a world where people aren't reasonable and are fundamentally irrational and insist that 2 + 2 = 5? There's an interesting, I think, debate going on in the UK at the moment behind the scenes. I don't know whether many people spotted it, but the most reputable institution doing work at the moment on public finance and taxation in the UK, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, came out with a report, I think a couple of weeks ago, and said, look, if we're going to start from a base where British public services are going to be financed at a fairly modest but reasonable level, then at the very minimum, income tax needs to go up by another 5p in the pound. VAT needs to go up substantially. Property taxes need to be raised very substantially, particularly for people in valuable property, and blah, 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 lots of other things too. But we all know that you can't have that conversation. My party, the Labour Party, even progressive people in the Tory party would never dream of raising issues like that in public, because they know that the public will not accept it. They know that there is an underlying assumption in the UK that we want American levels of tax and European levels of spending. And it is a sort of, there is a fundamental public irrationality in a lot of these debates. So how do you introduce, of course this goes back to where democracy fits into it, so how do you apply Rawlsian principles of fairness and justice in a world where you're not dealing with reasonable assumptions, and that the public are not reasonable, they're not necessarily rational in the way that they approach a lot of these problems?
Yes, with difficulty. I think you're right that the assumption that people are fundamentally reasonable, and by reasonable what Rawls means is that they want to live in a society that can be justified to their fellow citizens. That is really a fundamental assumption of Rawls's whole philosophy. I don't think it's such an unreasonable assumption to make. I think that people, I mean, I suppose there's different aspects of reasonableness, but I think taking that bit of it first, the desire to justify the way that we organize society to our fellow citizens, I think that is still the basic framework within which democratic politics, including in the UK, operates. People don't just go about saying, I want taxes to be cut because it would benefit me. It might be that that's ultimately the reason why some people argue for certain positions, but the basic contours of our political debate still are such that people feel they need to justify the reasons why they think taxes should be lower, for example, by reference to the benefits that might have for society at large. So I think, I suppose that would be one first thought, is that the idea that people are reasonable and want to justify their political positions to others, not just in terms of their self-interest, but according to some notion of fairness. I think that is mostly held up by the mainstream of our existing democratic debate. On the question of taxes, and this, I guess, the contradiction between the various things that people appear to want, low taxes, but also well-funded public services, I guess I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I think there's an important role for people outside of politics in trying to make it possible for politicians to have that kind of conversation. I think it's why institutions like the IFS are so important, and in a sense the purpose of my book and of other books like it is to do something similar, to try to expand the space of political possibility by persuading people that different ways of doing things are desirable, and also that they're possible by engaging with, I guess, a mix of of questions about values, and then the evidence about how different policies would work in practice. So I think that that there are different actors in society, different agents, I guess, have different roles in trying to move us towards a more reasonable and rational public conversation. And if it's true that, to some extent politicians are very constrained, that puts the emphasis more on other people in civil society. I also think, though, that politicians could be braver in trying to lead the public conversation in these kinds of areas. And I think when you actually look at the survey evidence on public support for changes in taxation is not quite along the lines of what people assume, which is that no one wants to pay higher taxes. I think there are some amazing long-run surveys that go back to the 1970s that look at public opinion on whether or not you would support an increase in taxes and how that relates to public services. I can't remember exactly what the questions are. But the first thing that really stands out is that they really haven't changed since the 1970s. So the idea that there was some massive shift in public opinion in the 70s that was what brought Margaret Thatcher to office is just not at all backed up by the evidence. So it hasn't changed. And more importantly, there's I wish I could remember the actual numbers, but there's a significant majority who are, I think the proportion of people who want taxes to go down is consistently below 10% over the whole period. And then there's a kind of even-ish balance between people who would like them to stay the same and those who would be willing to see them go up. And I think in recent years we've seen the proportion of people who would like taxes to increase in order to improve public services go up. Now, obviously, these surveys are difficult. It's hard to know how people would...
preferably someone else paying. But
yeah, so that those surveys are tricky because they don't really put to people the trade-offs in a very specific way. But I think they suggest that it would be possible for politicians to make compelling arguments for a different way of doing things. And I think we've sort of seen. I think what might be possible is also to make a kind of virtue out of necessity. It's not. Politicians make difficult arguments. The argument that David Cameron and George Osborne made in 2010 to slash public services and impose austerity, they argued that was difficult but necessary, and they managed to persuade people to do something that they also didn't want to do, which was to see the quality of public services and all sorts of other things that taxpayers' money pays for go down. And I don't see why it wouldn't be possible to make the same argument in reverse. And I think there's such a widespread recognition now after 14 years of austerity that public services are crumbling, that we've had an unprecedented period of economic stagnation, and that low investment, both public and private, is really the root cause of those problems. And I don't think there's any fundamental reason why a political party couldn't make a powerful argument that acknowledges that paying taxes is difficult, but persuades people that it would be worth it given all the other things that they care about. But you've got experience in actual politics. So
I invite you to go out with me and knock on doors and tell people that. But anyway, we've had a fair bit on tax and British domestic politics. But you made the point a few minutes ago when we were talking about the IFS, about the role that independent institutions in a democratic society can play through public debate. And probably there's no more important institutions of that kind than universities. But universities are not so much in the UK. I mean, we don't get this in the LSE so much, but certainly in American universities and elsewhere, and in civil society. I mean, we've seen this in Scotland this week. There is this feeling that how do we have a debate based on reasonableness if we have in our midst people who are fundamentally unreasonable and intolerant and provocatively so? How do we deal with people who want to have a meeting in a university advocating radical Islam and saying that we'd rather women didn't come into this meeting, or teachers in universities who would insist on deliberately misgendering in order to provoke an argument and causing deep offense and alarm. So how do we, in a world where we assume, in your world, that people are fundamentally reasonable, how do we realistically and fairly exclude extreme unreasonableness? And how, in a university context particularly, where you would draw the line? And have the American Ivy League universities drawn the line in the wrong way, or where do you stand on that, and where would Rawls stand on that?
I think it's such a difficult question, and I think that that where we should draw the limits of acceptable speech, also, and I suppose they depend on the context in which that speech is happening. So I think, there's the traditional debate about free speech is about legal restrictions on speech that apply to society at large, and that's something that have thought more about. Exactly how that applies within a university context, I think, is difficult. I think when it comes to legal restrictions on speech, I think we should be very careful about limiting speech. I think there are situations where that is desirable. So I think we can ban speech that is directly threatening or constitutes harassment of specific individuals. I also think we can intervene to prevent speech where there's a very clear and direct threat of physical violence. But generally speaking, and in line with Rawls's idea, that just gone off? Anyway, I'll keep going. So yeah, generally speaking, I think beyond those quite special cases, we shouldn't be imposing blanket bans on particular points of view, even views that are outright racist or anti-democratic. I think that we have a duty to condemn those kinds of views, but that we should be, rather than using the coercive power of the state to ban them, which I think is not necessarily effective and open to all sorts of abuse. And I think often when hate speech laws have been in place, they have often been abused. But, we don't only have that coercive power. The state also has a kind of expressive power through, for example, the way that it organizes the education system. So I think the state can be very active in promoting certain core liberal and democratic values in the school system. I think it should be free to withdraw funding and support from organizations that advocate for explicitly hateful or anti-democratic views. But I think that's so I realize I've not answered your question about universities, because I suppose I'm thinking it through on the spot, and first starting with the case that I know best, which is overall legal restrictions on speech. I think in the case of universities, it's very difficult. I think beyond the question of what the law should look like, that most organizations should have quite wide leeway to determine their own internal rules. And Rawls's principles they're very explicitly principles for how we should organize our basic legal system. They're not meant to be principles for how we should organize all the various different clubs and associations and societies that exist in society. And for the most part, I think they should be free to determine their own rules. I think universities are difficult because they also do serve a very important public purpose, but integral to that public purpose is that they are spaces of free inquiry. And I think I'm going to sort of avoid giving a clear answer to the question, because I think it requires more thought. But I think I would be inclined to have quite weak formal restrictions on the kind of speech that is allowable specifically within universities because of the essential importance of freedom of expression.
But relating it particularly to this week's controversies in Scotland, I mean, should people have the right to cause really grievous offence not to provoke violence, but just to be deeply, deeply offensive. Is that a freedom that Rawls and yourself would uphold?
I think that people should not be free to harass and threaten other people. But yeah, I do think that people should be free to express deeply offensive positions in certain contexts. I don't think we should have blanket bans on any point of view. And I think that we can, I think that position doesn't mean saying that that hateful and anti-democratic speech doesn't cause harms, and it doesn't mean ignoring those harms. It means finding other ways to overcome and combat them. But yeah, I think I would be, I don't think that Scottish law is right. I don't think we should be, so I think it bans derogatory language on the basis of various characteristics like sex, race, and gender. And I think, however offensive we find that language, and as you know, as a gay person, I also know what it's like to be the target of that kind of language. And I think people should be prevented from, abusing me directly. But I don't think that they should be prevented if people want to post their hateful views on the internet. I think that they should be free to do so.
Good. Well, thank you. What I propose to do now, I've got one last question, which I have prepared you for, so you've got a chance to think about it. And then sort of open it up to discussion, so if you want to start thinking about your interventions. But the last question I wanted to ask is you have ventured into the political world, and you've set up the Chandler party, right? And you're competing at the next election, and we'll forget about donor limits and all that stuff. But you're going to introduce a Tony Blair pledge card. What are the top 3 things based on the philosophy that you've expounded that you would want to have there?
Great question. And I guess that I'll answer it on the basis of what I think would be best rather than most likely to win the election, because that's more my expertise. But I think first would be a commitment to getting money out of politics, and specifically to ban or limit private donations to political parties to a very low level, and to replace that with a democracy voucher system, which would give every citizen an equal amount of money that they could use to fund the political party of their choice. I think that would be the simplest way to address the most obvious injustice with our political system, and one that distorts it in all sorts of ways, and that it follows very naturally from the basic democratic commitment to political equality. It's also something that we know has worked, at least on a small scale, in practice. So it's a system that currently operates in Seattle for local and regional elections, and it's worked very well, and it's had exactly all the effects that you would expect a policy like that to have. So I think first thing would address the role of money in politics by introducing a democracy voucher system. The second, I guess, on the opportunity front, I'm tempted to say abolishing private schools, but I actually think the thing that would do more to advance equality of opportunity would be to provide universal early years education. I think that in terms of impact on people's opportunities, that would have the biggest effect. So I think I would start there. And then third, I think, would be to introduce a system of greater workplace democracy. So I think that would involve having workers on boards. I think the ideal system would give workers half of the seats on the boards of most companies, and also instituting democratically elected works councils in large companies so that workers have a real say over how their work is organized. And I think that is important because it recognizes that equality is not just about the distribution of money. It's also about how our society distributes power and control, and the opportunities that people have for meaningful work, which is such an important source of self-respect. And so I think I would want something that pushes us in that direction and doesn't that goes beyond the narrowly redistributive paradigm that has dominated progressive politics for a long time, and recognizes that economic justice is about more than that.
Well, thank you. In fact, I think your answer in many ways encapsulates what we're trying to achieve here, which is not just get a philosopher who's logical, but will come up with something original. I'd never heard of democracy vouchers. Maybe I'm missing something, but it strikes me at first sight it's an incredibly good idea. So thank you for that.
Good note on which to conclude this bit.
Right, who wants to start? There's a microphone at the back, and I guess you bring it down. There's a gentleman on the front row wants to have it first back.
Bit scary to go first. Thank you very much for the time. I was just going to ask on the co-managing idea, and it's clearly been very helpful in Germany. I think Japan benefits a bit from cross-holdings as well in terms of thinking long-term about businesses and giving power to those people that work there. One of the challenges, though, has been that it's not very well suited for kind of disruptive environments. So in Germany, for instance, the auto manufacturers have suffered somewhat by having employee representatives, or this is how it's often framed in terms of addressing moving to electric vehicles, because actually it's not in the incentive for many of the employees to push the companies to adopt a new technology, which would require very different skill sets and many fewer employees. So when kind of thinking about how appropriate that is for an economy or a society, how do you adjust for that? Because also it clearly has some advantages. It also has some drawbacks, and I'd just be interested in how you think about it.
Just go. We'll take each question one by one. So yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that part of the answer is probably to exclude the smallest firms from the full requirements of workplace democracy or co-management, particularly because it's small firms that drive a lot of innovation in the economy. And I think that's also true. I have a discussion as well as of co-management of the role of cooperatives, and it's particularly true, I think, with cooperatives that although cooperatives, once they're up and running, tend to perform as well, if not better, than their conventionally owned counterparts, it's really hard to get a cooperative started mostly because of the difficulties of raising capital. And I think that's not a problem that we can wish away, and even having a cooperative bank, which would make a big difference, wouldn't eliminate the problem. In that case, that's one of the reasons why I don't think it would be the ideal economy is not one where every firm is a cooperative, because I think that would be very bad for innovation. Instead, so on the cooperatives case, what I think we should do is accept that most new firms will be capitalist firms, will be owned in the conventional way, but then give workers the right to initiate a vote on transforming existing up and running firms into cooperatives at a later stage, and to put in place some kind of financing mechanism for that. So I guess that's the kind of thing that I think you would want to do. I think you want to make sure that you don't dampen innovation in too serious a way. How that looks for larger firms, I think it's difficult to say. I think in Germany, I'm sure there will be cases where it has impeded the ability of a firm to innovate, and others where it might have helped. I think there's quite a bit of evidence that in recessions, when there's a real need for flexibility, actually it's been companies that involve their workers that have been able to adjust the best, because they've been able to persuade workers, first of all, that the information they're being given, the claim that the company is in crisis, is real, because there's a requirement on the company to share actual, the truth, the actual data about how the company is doing with the workers. So there's a degree of trust there. And also they tend to be more able to then adjust, so they're more likely to reduce people's hours rather than to lay people off, and that's more likely to win the consent of the workforce. So I think it's difficult. I think on balance, looking at the countries that exist, even where co-management is quite advanced, there doesn't seem to be an overall negative effect. Whether that could be tweaked in particular industries or in ways that would that might be even better. I think we should be open to that, but I don't think I have a kind of ready answer to exactly what it would look like.
I'll just add a couple of points, if I might. From my own experience in government, I wanted to introduce workers on boards to deal with executive pay, But then there's the problem about how do you identify the representative workers, particularly if you have a multinational company and you've got, you know, workers all over the world. You know, there may be in African gold mines or Canadian forests or whatever. How do you do it? And the second problem, which Daniel alluded to, is if you're venturing outside your traditional kind of capitalist structure, how do you raise capital, right? Because if you're ruling out raising risk capital through private investors or stock exchanges, you'll then have to raise capital by organically, which is slow, or you borrow, right? And what has destroyed so many non-traditional type of models is that they then become wholly reliant on banks. I mean, I was chair of a very large social enterprise that went bust in the pandemic because you've got no cushion for risk. You know, there are real problems with getting these alternative models operating. Right, second question. I like the principle of alternating men and women, but are there any women questioners? Yes, okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I like the manifesto, very important points, but I sort of see a gap in something here. What about health? We have an aging population, and the sort of healthy life, you know, number of years that people can live a healthy life is declining. You know, the number is declining rather than improving in this country. So what about health? What's your vision for providing healthcare?
Yeah, great, thank you. So in terms of where that fits into the kind of philosophical framework of the book, for me, healthcare sort of primarily falls under the principle of equality of opportunity, that having the access to healthcare shouldn't depend on your own sort of private financial resources, and that's important because being in good health is essential for being able to take advantage of all of the opportunities that exist in our society. And I think that would lead me to support a healthcare system that the basic structure of which is what we have here, a publicly funded NHS, but properly publicly funded. I don't think we need necessarily great institutional innovation there. I think we just need to make sure that the NHS is funded properly. So I think I have a sort of uninteresting answer to that question, which is that the system that we have is basically the right one. We just need to do it properly.
Good. The gentleman on the front row.
Thank you. My question is about sort of, I guess, zooming out a bit to a more macro level, because one of the key areas of inequality that sort of is that's sort of becoming more and more obvious is in the area of the impact of climate change, where those who have caused it are definitely not those who are most deeply impacted by it. And sort of on the wider biodiversity framework, there was something put forward at the last, not the past COP, the one before that, where some of the African nations got together and made a proposal for something they called biodiversity dividends, in which case they said, well, you want us not to develop our rainforests and our savannas, but we kind of want to have electricity and running water for our people. So if you're not going to pay us to not develop those things, then yes, we're going to farm them and cut the trees. And saying that, you know, if you want us to do this, then you need to pay for it in some way, because otherwise it's unfair to expect people in those countries to live in a permanently lower state of development. But then now we're looking at those of us who live in rich countries have contributed a lot more to climate change, and it's those who are in the poorer countries who are really suffering from its more immediate effects. So what sort of thoughts do you have on the macro level, like, you know, not the company or even country level, but on the international level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I suppose first just on the question of sustainability, which I realized I didn't mention earlier. And I think, any political philosophy that didn't have something to say about that question would be inadequate for the moment that we're living in right now. And although it sort of tends to get less attention, Rawls has these two, his freedom and equality principles are what get most of the attention. But there is also a third sustainability principle, or it's a principle of what he calls intergenerational justice, justice between generations. And actually, Rawls was pretty much the first philosopher to give a systematic account of that idea. And the most basic requirement of it is that basically a principle of sustainable development, that we pass on to future generations, and that we preserve the natural resources that society depends on for future generations and don't deplete them. So I think and in the book I sort of set out some of the policies that I think would help achieve that at a domestic level. But the question you're asking is really about sort of justice between countries. It's about global justice and the obligations that rich countries have to poorer countries, specifically in the context of climate. But I think it's sort of part of a bigger question about what rich countries owe poorer ones. And I'm going to slightly dodge it because basically I don't. So it's not something that I really look at in the book. Rawls is clear that those principles of justice are fundamentally principles of what he calls domestic justice, justice within a country. And he distinguishes that from local justice, which is like, how should we organize the particular communities and societies that exist within a country, and then global justice, which is how should we think about relationships between countries. Obviously, both sets of questions are really fundamentally important, but I think they sort of deserve a thorough treatment in their own right, and that's not something that I've tried to do in the book. But I mean, intuitively, I feel very, I think I would be very supportive of the kind of, I think first of all, the fact that rich countries there are lots of reasons why rich countries might have obligations to support poorer ones in making the transition to a more sustainable economy based on historic emissions and also just on existing standards of living. I think something like those biodiversity dividends sounds like a great idea, but it's not something that I've thought about in lots of detail.
Hi, my question is actually directed to Vince. I'm just wondering, given your experience in politics, how open do you think people would be in reality to this fresh way of kind of thinking around some of these concepts?
I don't think they are, sadly. I mean, I did try to be a little bit, but I think there's a sort of fundamental moral problem you've touched on here, actually, that should politicians be honest? And I think there's a deeper issue about should we all be honest in our relationships? And I think, in many relationships are sustained by having a veil of reticence pulled over them. And I think in many ways that's true in politics, but it's not sustainable. This is the problem. I mean, and it goes back to the last question, right? We've got this massive problem of climate change, right? It's going to have to be faced sooner rather than later. And although we like to pretend it would all be painless and there would be millions of green jobs and all these wonderful things, actually it is adjustment, and for the rich countries to exercise the necessary level of restraints on demand is going to be very painful. And we discovered already, with Macron and his taxes, and Germany and their boilers, that the public do not like it and react badly to being told that they have to make painful choices. So my instincts as a now comfortably retired politician is that you have to spell these things out, but that you may get a very bad outcome. There aren't too many examples of people going into government and saying, I'm afraid it's going to be hell for the next few years, but it's very important for the country that you put up with it. I had a quite trenchant argument with my former party leader when we went into the coalition, and I argued that we should make that argument, that it is going to be bloody awful for the next few years, but we've got to do it. But unfortunately, nobody understood what I was trying to say, and the view prevailed that we have to try and promise stuff, give people hope. There's a very good phrase which emerged from the current political campaigning. There's this guy called Wes Streeting, who is I think the Labour Health spokesman, who came out with a phrase a few months ago, and he said, "No hope is better than false hope." I mean, it's a very honest statement, chilling, and I suspect it's not going to get any further in his entourage, but that probably is what honesty means at the moment.
Just to come in on that, I feel like we don't only face the choice between no hope and false hope, and I guess the point of a book like this is to persuade people that different ways of doing things are both justified according to principles that are really very widely held and are achievable. That if we look around the world, there are countries that are doing all sorts of different things in different ways, and that's a part of the book, I guess, is trying to draw lots of those ideas together to overcome the sense that it's impossible to do anything differently. If we did, everything would fall apart, to try and sort of gradually shift that debate to make this kind of politics more possible and to give people hope, so that if it's not coming from politicians, that people start to demand it, and ultimately that's how politics changes. It comes from people demanding things, and some kind of that sort of iterative relationship between citizens and the people who represent them. And I think I was just thinking, Vince, about what you were saying about no one coming into office saying this is going to be difficult, not presenting people with hard choices. But I think that that has also happened. I think that's what Thatcher did. No one, I don't think anyone at the time thought that was an easy process to go through, and she managed to do that, and in the process establish a kind of economic consensus that has lasted for decades. So I think we have models from history that suggest that it is possible to make difficult arguments, but that they need to be made with real conviction, and they need to resonate in some way with what's with what's going on in the moment that those arguments are being made. And I think that just as in the 70s there was a sense of crisis which enabled someone like Thatcher to establish a new kind of economic consensus, I think we're in a similar moment now where there is a widespread sense that the kinds of economic sort of model of economic management that's dominated in recent decades and the ways of thinking about society are not working, and there is a struggle for something new, and I think there is an opportunity for someone to achieve something similar, and hopefully in a different direction.
Yes, Churchill often promised blood, sweat and tears, but that was wartime. I'm not sure we can do it in peacetime. But anyway, your answer's a better one than mine. Realistic hope. Okay, gentleman in the middle in the blue shirt.
This will be our last question.
Hi, we're going to have an election in the next few months, and all three parties, as far as I can see, with respect, are not promising to do what the Institute of Fiscal Studies has suggested needs to be done, and yet all three are saying that they will rectify the health service, the water service, etc., and education. What would you change in Britain in the next 12 months so that we could have the debate which is honest about the transferring of wealth to the public sector?
Yeah, I don't know if there is a simple institutional change that would guarantee a more honest conversation. I think maybe the best hope that we would have would be to empower an institution like the OBR, so a kind of government-backed independent body, to just to spell out the consequences. And to some extent they do this already, but to spell out the consequences of the different choices that we face, that would be, I think that's the sort of best hope for some kind of institutional reform that would force a more honest conversation. But in the end, I think it's, you know, it's the process, the ongoing process of democracy that will force that conversation to happen. You know, the election will end and a new government will come in. It may have made contradictory promises, and it will be forced to reconcile them in one way or another, and to do so, hopefully, you know, in the way that's both consistent with its values and with a desire to win the next election. And I think if that government is the Labour Party, then I hope that they will, you know, that they will recognise that it is possible to raise taxes, and that it's going to be necessary, that it won't lead to some kind of terrible collapse in our economy. And I hope, you know, I suppose my hope is that they might start to, if not promise that now, at least prepare the intellectual environment and political environment for different kinds of arguments to be made. I think, you know, it's difficult to make those kinds of arguments, and it takes time, and at the very least some kind of sense of strategic communications is necessary, that a sense that they're trying to shift the argument. And, you know, even if they're not talking immediately about what they would do to taxes, at least trying to popularize the economics, which is that even if we did do that, things wouldn't fall apart. At least that's a kind of precondition, I suppose, for making the more political argument.
I think the cynical answer is that the magic money tree has been replaced by the growth fairy. And, you know, if the fairy can deliver growth, then you can have more of everything and less taxes to go with it. But liberating the growth fairy is difficult. And it may well, I mean, going back to Rawls, it may involve surrendering some of your basic freedoms. You know, if somebody wants to build a 10-story block of flats at the bottom of your garden, depriving you of the right to object, which would, in a crude sense, is what planning reform means. Anyway, I'll leave you with that dispiriting thought. And just thank you very, very much for introducing your book. I'm not sure exactly what happens next. I mean, there are some books at the end.
Yeah, I think I'll be back there signing books for anyone
books,
who wants one.
And you're here to... there
first
were
chance
quite a
to
few
buy the
hands
paperback.
at the end. People still wanted to ask questions. I think, you know,
Yeah,
we're here
be around
to help
chat.
with all that. But thank you very much for coming. Been a very good audience.
Thanks.